So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Platonic dialogue, the Sophist. This is part 9. So we are a decent way into this dialogue. Recounting everything up until now is not going to be a simple task. So I'd recommend that if anybody is curious about where we have been, to start back at episode 1. But to give a little bit of an introduction, how this reading and reflection has gone so far has been to read 2 pages in entirety, and then to go back over them nearly line by line, and to interpret and to reflect on the content. We just finished a fairly large segment, I think, in this dialogue, talking about that which is and that which is not. There has been an establishment such that that which is not that which is an identity in and of itself, but it is also something that occupies difference. It shares and blends with difference. And because of this otherness, what is introduced is the concept of nothingness, that which is not. But it is by difference, it is by that which is not, that we can identify, that identities can exist at all. And the second thing I'll say is, in the backdrop of all of this, the main purpose of the dialogue is to find the Sophist, this character that we are hunting. And so we've come out of this territory that we've been in, that we've been focusing on, and we're about to start a slightly new path. So it's a good time, I think, to begin this episode anew. So I'd like to jump right into this. The visitor is a character that is from a Greek colony in Italy called Elea. And then we have the other interlocutor, who is Theaetetus, who is an Athenian youth. He is associated with Socrates, and he is talking with this visitor. So, beginning with the visitor, he says, "For speech is being one kind among those that are. If we were deprived of that, we'd be deprived of philosophy, to mention the most important thing. Besides, now we have to agree about what speech is. But we'd be able to say nothing if speech were taken away from us, and weren't anything at all. And it would be taken away if we admitted that there's no blending of anything with anything else." Theaetetus says, "This last thing is right, anyway, but I don't understand why we have to agree about speech." "Well, perhaps you'll understand if you follow me this way." "Where?" "That which is not appeared to us to be one kind among others, but scattered over all those which are." "Yes." "So next we have to think about whether it blends with belief and speech." "Why?" "If it doesn't blend with them, then everything has to be true. But if it does, then there will be false belief and false speech, since falsity in thinking and speaking amount to believing and saying those that are not." "Yes." "And if there's falsity, then there's deception." "Of course." "We said that the Sophist had escaped into this region, but that he denied that there has come to be or is such a thing as falsity. For he denied that anyone either thinks or says that which is not, on the ground that that which is not never in any way has a share in being. That's what he said. But now it apparently does share in that which is, so he probably wouldn't still put up a fight about that. Perhaps, though, he might say that some forms share in that which is not, and some don't, and that speech and belief are ones that don't. So he might contend again that copy-making and appearance-making, in which we said he was contained, totally are not. His ground would be that the belief and speech don't associate with that which is not, and that without this association, falsity totally is not. That's why we have to search around for speech, belief, and appearance, and first discover what they are, so that when they appear, we see their association with that which is not clearly. Then when we've seen that clearly, we can show that falsity is. And when we've shown that we can tie the sophist up in it, if we can keep hold of him, or else we'll have let him go and look for him in another kind. Theaetetus responds, "What you said at the start seems absolutely true. The sophist is a hard kind to hunt down. He seems to have a whole supply of roadblocks, and whenever he throws one down in our way, we have to fight through it before we can get to him. But now, when we've barely gotten through the one about how that which is not, he throws another down, and we have to show that falsity is present in both speech and belief. And next, it seems, there will be another and another after that. A limit, it seems, never appears." The visitor says, "Even if you can only make a little progress, Theaetetus, you should cheer up. If you give up in this situation, what will you do some other time when you don't get anywhere or even are pushed back? A person like that could hardly capture a city, as the saying goes. But since we've done what you just said, my friend, the largest wall may already have been captured, and the rest of them may be lower and easier." "Fine," says Theaetetus. "Then let's take up speech and belief, as we said just now. That way we can calculate whether that which is not comes into contact with them, or whether they're totally true and neither one is ever false." "All right. Come on, then. Let's think about names again, the same way as we spoke about forms and letters of the alphabet. What we're looking for seems to lie in that direction." Theaetetus says, "What kind of question about them do we have to answer?" The visitor, "Whether they all fit with each other, or none of them do, or some of them will, and some of them won't. Anyway, it's clear some of them will and some of them won't. Maybe you mean something like this. Names that indicate something when you say them one after the other fit together. The names that don't signify anything when you put them in a row don't fit." "What do you mean?" says Theaetetus. "The same thing I thought you were assuming when you agreed with me just now, since there are two ways to use your voice to indicate something about being." "What are they?" "One kind is called names, and the other kind is called verbs." "Tell me what each of them is." "A verb is a sort of indication that's applied to an action." "Yes, and a name is a kind of spoken sign that is applied to things that perform the actions." "Definitely. So no speech is formed just from names spoken in a row, and also not from verbs that are spoken without names." "I didn't understand that," says Theaetetus. "Clearly, you were focusing on something else when you agreed with me just now. What I meant was simply this. Things don't form speech if they are said in a row like this." "Like what?" The visitor says, For example, walks, runs, sleeps, and other verbs that signify actions. Even if somebody said all of them one after the other, that wouldn't be speech. So that concludes our 2 pages. So let's get into this step by step. Now, beginning with on the previous page, the first bit of dialogue bleeds into our next page, the pages that we are on. Beginning with the visitor, he says, "For speeches being one kind among those that are. If we were deprived of that, we'd be deprived of philosophy, to mention the most important thing. Besides, now we have to agree about what speech is. But we'd be able to say nothing if speech were taken away from us, and weren't anything at all. And it would be taken away if we admitted that there's no blending of anything with anything else." So this is where we're going to have to start. And forgive me for a moment, and I'll explain why. Because I have to grab something, as is probably apparent by my distant voice. Now, as I return, what I have brought with me is a bit of a diagram. Maybe not a diagram, that's the wrong word to use. It's a it's a representation. It's a symbolic representation using different chess pieces. So I have a small little book that serves as the foundation or the base of this scene. And as I mentioned, I have various chess pieces that are set up about this in a particular arrangement for a particular purpose. These chess pieces are actually pretty cool. They're made of metal. It's from Turkey. I suppose that doesn't matter all that much, but anyway, the following pieces are what I have. I have the king, the bishop, the queen, the knight, and the rook. All of these serve as primary identities, and depending on where I go with it, I might change their identity to imagine a different scenario. I also have pawns. I have 3 pawns that are standing about, and they represent otherness, the extensions of difference. Difference itself as a identity is identified by the bishop. The king represents that which is. Now, the others are just sort of placeholder identities for now. That allows us to see that the extension of difference allows us to see things that are separate from the identity of that which is, and the various identities that participate in being, or participate in that which is. Now we could say that speech is one of those. Let's take the knight, and we'll label the knight as speech. The visitor says, "And it would be taken away if we admitted that there's no blending or anything with anything else." So this concept of blending in the last episode was an important point of attention. And like with many things that are fundamental, it can be kind of difficult to get a grasp on exactly what we're talking about. So when I think of blending, you can think about anything that involves mixture. You can think about a blender. In a blender, there are many different identities: celery, banana, carrot. You put them all together, mix them up, and they are all the constituent elements are now all sort of together, and we consume that and we enjoy it. We get all of the vitamins and minerals, the sugars, calories, etc. But what's important is, I suppose there's a few different levels that we can identify this, or think about this, reflect on this. One is that of things that blend, there are distinct identities of things. There are certain qualities, measurable quantities, whatever, that come from somewhere. Even if something is in a mixed or blended state, we can identify or trace back something to an independent lineage. Now, it's important when we speak about things like speech or language, because there are a lot of interrelated parts. There is the production, the manipulation of sound. There is the articulation, which involves muscular contraction. It involves cognition. It involves thought formation, problem solving in many cases, idea formation, logic, reasoning. And so all of these things have to come together in some way to produce speech. Now, if everything was separate and unable to be blended, like, for example, my mouth could only move without the generation of the manipulation of matter, let's say, to produce sound, then speech would be severely affected. It couldn't verbalize. So although this might seem fairly straightforward, it's important when we think about things and concepts like that which is not. Of course, speech is involved in that which is. Theaetetus is confused. He says, I don't understand why we have to agree about speech. The visitor says, that which has not appeared to us to be one kind among others, but scattered over all those which are. Now, this is just what I described earlier. By the king, represented as, or rather he represents that which is, and spread out in sort of the four-quadrant type format. Speaking of the chess pieces, we have different identities that share in that which is, that share in being, separated by otherness, separated by difference. And so we can have an identity that can, in one hand, be something that is its own identity, and then have a function such that its identity does not, let's say, interfere with the extent of its influence. We have to think about whether it blends with belief and speech, says the visitor. If it doesn't blend with them, then everything has to be true. So this is another way of putting this, as we saw earlier. He says, and it would be taken away if we admitted that there is no blending or anything with anything else, of anything with anything else, speaking of speech. Now, what does this mean? Now, we can think both about speech and we can think about that which is. Of course, speech is something that is, so we can consider both. But if we think specifically about that which is, if that which is doesn't blend with them being any number of identities, for which there are billions and trillions of identities, then everything has to be true. Now, one of the primary reasons for this is because of otherness, is because of difference, because of distinction. It's because of this that we may fall into confusion about something. that because of separation, and because of the intermixing of things, the interrelatedness among things, it can be quite difficult to separate out one identity from another in the truest form without making a mistake. If there was no interweaving, much like a sock, for whatever reason I'm thinking about it, if you look close enough at a sock, you can see how interwoven the fibers of a sock are. If the sock was just one uniform piece of fabric, then of course the various strands in a regular sock, for which we can say they are their own identities, would not necessarily exist. It would be a separate sort of thing. Now, of course, the sock is not continuous independent strands, but the matrix, the network, is the analogy that I want to pull from that. He says, but if it does, then there will be false belief and false speech. Now again, why is this the case? Why would there be false belief and false speech if there is blending? Well, again, because there is difference. Because there is this ability to separate. Now, falsity is that which is not true. We could say that it is that which is not, to a degree, but that which is not true. Now, that which is not is still something that I maintain is subject to that which is, but it participates in a way with that which is quite intimately. That which is sort of allows it to be so that it doesn't fall in on itself. That which is not is the thing that defines, the thing that places boundaries, separate from the concept of that which is, and other things that are. But again, given the interwoven nature and the relatedness among things, it's quite easy to see how we can make a mistake and deceive ourselves into thinking that one thing is true, when in fact, because of this relation or that relation in this context, it happens to be false. It happens to be separated by difference in a way that we had not seen. The visitor. But if it does, then there will be false belief and false speech, since falsity in thinking and speaking amount to believing and saying those that are not. Now, it's kind of an interesting path to go down, because up until now we've been speaking about that which is not, and I kind of want to throw absence in there as well, just more of a proverbial or and psalmist interpretation in there, that wickedness and evil from our perspective often involves this absence or non-being. And by this non-being, by this that which is not distinction, what we are identifying is a pattern, of course. It's easy for the mind to go to absence and non-being as almost like the stereotypical outer space floating into nothingness without anything around, the complete darkness. And while I think it's one way to think about absence and to think about nothing, it doesn't really suffice anymore, philosophically. It's much easier to think about nothingness as a related term. It must be a related term, because it is the thing that describes difference. It is the thing that describes difference difference between two identities, two things that are. Now, if we are to focus on that thing which separates, I pose the question to myself, when we identify it, when we identify the pawn that is separating that which is from some other identity, when we say something that is false, are we focusing on the pawn, or are we focusing on the relationship? And it's kind of difficult for me to answer. We're not focusing on the pawn, I think, in terms of the principal identity, like the bishop. For the bishop is the symbolic representation of difference and otherness, and that which is not, non-being. But the pawn is that experience of non-being, or the productive capacity of that which is not. And that which is notness is the thing that is in between, but in between insofar as to separate, to serve as a barrier between the two. Now, I maintain to a degree the assertion I made previously that we may identify in mind a problem about a separation between two identities, and we can make the mistake about where difference is between the two identities, especially given a shared sense of being, for example. I think in a more ignorant period, or perhaps of many things for which I'm still ignorant, but I want to choose something that a relatively simple example that I can understand. And it's funny, in fact, tomorrow I'll have to review this sort of intermediate, or I have to go through this remedial post-test situation at work where I have to review some answers that apparently I didn't answer a sufficient number of answers on a test correctly, and it's kind of a troublesome sort of thing. Not the biggest deal in the world, but it's still interesting nonetheless, because of now we're speaking about falsehood and false belief. But what necessarily must have happened there was a misrepresentation of either the identities or of the ways in which the identities are different. So forgive me, but today is a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. Now, that last bit of recording I ended up deleting. It was maybe a couple seconds worth, but I had mentioned that there's another part in which the visitor is speaking of that which is not. Another way in which he is speaking of that which is not. But for the life of me, I can't really remember what I was going to say. So we're just going to continue as we were. But before we move on, I do want to reflect on the word belief. I think it can often be a troublesome term, a term that can be associated with superstition. It can have rather negative connotation to it, but also it has quite a beautiful connotation in another way and in another perspective. What we find beautiful, what energizes our spirit, comes from a matter of belief, whatever that happens to be. And out of all of the possibilities, the good and the bad, I see this belief as being something so fundamental to our experience that reducing it to the common, superficial, perhaps even political warfare that we experience when we encounter this word this really should have no bearing on it. For a belief is something that we think to be true. We act as if it is true. It may depend on evidence, it may not. There are many things that one can believe. But in the Platonic sense, when we were thinking about difference, when we were thinking about identity, whether we come there through intuition, philosophical inquiry, or observation, there is an identification of identity. There is a state of difference. There's a state of separation that leads one to believe something to be true. It's a recognition of a particular type of pattern. Now, of course, there are many different types of beliefs. Some are more fundamental than others. But the pattern of belief, much like speech, is something that can be misinterpreted. And for my part, I find it easy to get caught up in the landscape of potential and the potential for misinterpretation, because the variability with regard to the relatedness among things is so great and so interwoven that a limited perception, a limited machine to observe such relations necessarily will mistake the way that they tend to be in their natural state, especially if they're in motion. But this matter of belief, I've been sort of skirting around it. I gave an informal definition just a moment ago. But I don't think it can be understated how deeply belief may find itself within us. I spoke, either on this episode or the last, of the way in which we, as cognitive agents, possessors of the soul and of the will, are these receivers, but we are also the givers. We participate. We ourselves are involved in this reciprocal relationship to that which is. We maintain our identity, but we also understand that it is not just us. It is not just I. I am not the king. I am not that which is. I am something that is, that shares in a much broader whole. Now, my belief about where I fit into that structure determines my behaviors. It tempers my heart. It tells me when to be excited and when to be relaxed, when to be relieved, when to anticipate. And if such a thing is downstream, the very way in which a man is, it would seem that belief must necessarily have a relationship to his soul, if it is not intimately connected to it. And by this I mean that the soul, being this conduit by which we may appreciate what we call the divine, through which we can experience it, through which we can reciprocate, we can give to something and also see what that giving does. I struggle sometimes to build that structure that is necessary to maintain the most stable identity. Most stable, perhaps, is a bit difficult to define, but a good identity. And maybe a good identity is not stable depending on its relations, but nonetheless, goodness among its various relations, both within and without human interaction, can take a lifetime of participation and of modifying desire to accomplish the beliefs that are requisite for a good life and a peaceful life. Now, why do I say all of that? Well, perhaps for no other reason than we are prompted to think about belief. And the possibility that if there were no such thing as false belief, then everything that would be believed would be true, because there would be no separation among things. There would be no way to see incorrectly. Even if we saw at an inferior level, the level at which we saw would always accurately scale all the way up to and within the picture of things that are, because they are always directly related to one another. The dynamism would cease. Change would be impossible. And in fact, the conditions that would be necessary for man to exist, I think, would be nil. It would be against the creative element, a fundamental principle of reality, it must be said. So let's move on from this. I'm going to read the second sentence so we can recap where we were, spoken by the visitor. But if it does, then there will be false belief and false speech, since falsity in thinking and speaking amount to believing and saying those that are not. If there's falsity, then there's deception. If there's deception, then necessarily the world will be full of copies, likenesses, and appearances. So what can we say of deception? It is a willful act on the part of one agent to another that recognizes something about reality. It recognizes something about the difference between two identities. And yet it uses that difference to blind the eyes of another identity. And so that identity is left off of the known map of the interwoven relatedness of that which is, left off into this sort of black abyss, approximating the edges of that map, only to be stuck in this confusion. And such a terrible thing it is to be deceived, to be lied to. He says, if there's deception, then necessarily the world will be full of copies. Copies are a reflection of the original. They are, in the physical sense, a duplication, a replication of the original. For some forms, I would say that its duplication is really no different than the original. What we call the original, or what becomes the original, may have been a copy of something else, maybe gaining or retaining some slightly different part of its identity to make it somewhat distinct. And then there are those that are very difficult to divide and to separate, to copy, for example. A building like Notre Dame, for example, this is very difficult to replicate. But a copy of a memo put through a copy machine, this is quite similar. In fact, the ability to tell the difference between the two would be quite difficult. And so the question is, why then, in a world of deception based on the definition that I've put forth, why then would the world be full of copies? Well, when we think about deception, we think about the willful misrepresentation of the truth. There must be some recreation of the environment, but a manipulation of certain elements within that environment. And often I think that the agents share most of the environment in common. It's just few elements that are manipulated, perhaps that are out of sight, or added beyond sight, such that the individual that is subject to deception falls prey to that false belief. So there we have a copy as it relates to deception. Now, likenesses, or likeness, is defined as the quality or state of being like, similarity or resemblance to something or someone, a representation that resembles a person or object. Now, likeness is different from a copy in the sense that the copy is an attempt, I think, to duplicate the original. But a likeness has something of similar characteristics. So, for example, something that comes to mind is a particular coworker. Somehow we dressed quite similarly a number of days in a row, and it became sort of a running joke. And I think we can say by this similarity in dress, there is a likeness there. I can also say that there's a likeness to myself and my father, for example, in terms of behavior, perhaps psychology, and appearance. So that brings us to the next word, then, appearance. The definition of appearance is the outward or visible aspect of a person or thing, a way that someone or something seems to be, often regardless of whether that seeming aligns with what truly is. The act of becoming visible or seen. Now, when we bring this back to the dialogue and we say, or we ask maybe the question of deception, how do these all participate in that world? Well, they seem to be tools that the deceiver can use to deceive the subject. The visitor says, "We said that the Sophist had escaped into this region, but that he denied that there has come to be or is such a thing as falsity. For he denied that anyone either thinks or says that which is not, on the ground that that which is not never in any way has any share in being." So I don't think that this affords much reflection after all we've been through. we can sort of clearly see why there would be a mismatch in what we are now thinking and what the sophist believes. The visitor says, but now it apparently does share in that which is, again by our dialectic. So he probably wouldn't still put up a fight about that. Perhaps, though, he might say that some forms share in that which is not, and some don't, and that speech and belief are the ones that don't. So let's think about the implications of this. So the concept that some forms share in that which is not, and some don't. So in other words, we can take some identity and say that it does not participate at all in difference. But I think if that was true, if that were to be true, then it would be barred from participation in other things that are. Because how can you have something that exists that is not separate from other things that exist, and also still participating with those things that are? I don't think it is possible. So we remove difference from the equation, and let's say we were just thinking about two identities. They would instantly become fused. They would become one identity. One identity that is not able to participate in anything. All other identities would be outside of whatever it is that we are sort of hypothetically considering. It would seem like it's an unstable state. Now I suppose we can make the argument, just to try and bolster the sophist's claim here, that difference, or that there may be a nested identity, and that the principality that had formed is subject to, imprisoned by, maybe, another identity. And that difference exists at the margins, trying to get at the internal identity, but always unable to do so. And you have sort of the other identities existing at the margins, staring at this protective outer identity, let's say. And to that I would say that it would be possible only if there was a graduated sense of identity, if there was difference involved. That the exterior would not be impermeable to difference, but that difference must exist inside of it to separate it from its external barrier, let's say. And then the question is, well, if this case seems reasonable, then is this sufficient? Maybe there is only difference within an identity to separate it internally, but externally, when difference and other identities come into contact with it, that it is not possible to see through to the difference inside. And to this, I think we have to think about the consequences of the initial condition of introducing difference to the identity within. Now, it can be said that since difference exists, otherness exists now between our sacred identity, let's say, just because it's something that we want to protect, so we'll call it sacred for now, and then the external, the defensive identity. When another identity comes into contact with the defensive identity. It's not necessarily the case that the internal identity must be related to the incoming visitor. Difference has identified the external identity, but there's nothing within the physical interaction or the conceptual minded awareness of that which is unseen, the internal identity. Just as another species can come to me and be completely unaware of what is inside of me, let's say in terms of the physical structure, organs and muscles and all this sort of thing. However, because difference and otherness exists and it permeates, it is possible for it to know it. And because it is possible to know it, I think there is this refutation of what the Sophist is saying. That some forms share in that which is not, and that some don't. Again, if some don't share in that which is not, then they are not identifiable. If we remove difference, this graduated identity would become one, and then immediately the external principalities would be aware of what is trying to be hidden, because there's a direct line to that which is not separated by this difference. And so I think here we can see how the Sophist may trick others to deceive others into believing that there is this sort of, I want to say hidden identity, but I think there's a better way to put this. And the better way to put this would depend on the argument that he's trying to make. But nonetheless, I do think that this conceptual image is enough to understand how this is probably not possible. He goes on to say that speech and belief are the ones that do not share in that which is not. They do not share in difference. So if that was the case, if speech and belief did not share in difference, we would all have the same thoughts. We would all have the same words spoken. Because there would be nothing sufficient to separate the... If we take another chess piece here, we take the knight, and we symbolize the knight as the concept of speech and language, just like the king is that which is. So now if every single thing that is thought and every single thing that is believed is reduced to the singular identity, without difference, it is completely uniform, by necessity, by reason. But of course, in our experience, this is not true. It doesn't take much to see that. So he might contend, again, that copy-making and appearance-making, in which we said he was contained, totally are not. So there's a bit of a curiosity that I have here. You know, it's such a difficult thing sometimes to try and define something. Maybe this is just for a mind like my own, perhaps one that's a bit distracted and a bit slow, maybe, in an informal sense. But definitions can have such an experience in them, or at least when one understands what a good definition can do to understanding and to participation. I think there's an unfortunate consequence in that there are many words and many definitions that become now seemingly foreign where at once they seem to be understood. I guess there's a risk with it, but the richness that there is with a good definition of something and understanding. Because much like many things in life, perhaps a skill, a professional skill, or an experience that one knows well. If one played a sport, I think they understand this quite well, that there's a development of the skill involved in the sport. For example, I did a lot of running when I was younger, and there's an art that's in suffering and in achieving optimal patterns of movement. And in this knowing, there is a deeper, richer type of knowing. Well, one can define exercise, let's say, and give a written explanation of it. But the one who practices it, who performs it regularly, has an entirely different relationship with it. And yet, in one way, the definition of the term really hasn't changed. And so, I say this to say because what I feel like is emerging, and ought to emerge in order to understand the Sophist, is that idea of experience, of being more than just able to define who he is in a literary sense, in a literal sense, but to experience him, to know him like we've met him before. And we may do that to create him within our own minds, or we find him in our minds, where he may exist, even if it be temporarily, in our moments of weakness, or whenever, that we can easily identify him and alter him, change him, destroy him. I like change him is probably best. So when I see that, when the visitor says, at least, on behalf of the Sophist, that he might contend again that copy-making and appearance-making, in which we said he was contained, totally are not. So he's gone from this shift between believing that that which is all that there is, and that important aspects of persuasion, perhaps, important aspects of, well, we may have to go back. Important aspects of knowing, I think, is a good, maybe not secondary place, but it's another place to at least to keep in mind, that knowing, understanding something, sort of similar to what we're talking about with this experience business. But a copy is made for a few different purposes. A copy isn't always to be a negative thing. But it can be a deceptive thing. Just like we can say about difference, it can be both allowing of that which is to permeate our experience, but by the sacrifice of experience itself, there is that risk of falsity and of all of the various ways in which things blend together. Maintaining identity for something that values its identity, to do it well, to be good, to do it rightly, is not an easy thing. But so the Sophist, we have identified that he is constrained, or that he now lives here. He's been chased there on the hunt. I think there's an implication, especially given the image of the hunt, that if the Sophist is running away from us, and what he runs to is a place where he feels safe, or most grounded, as we'll see in a second, then everything that we have chased him from, the places that he has been, even places that he has frequented, are now given up. And I think all of those places symbolically probably represent places in his experience that may serve as a cloud to his real beliefs. And I wonder how much psychologically one's own awareness plays into this. Certainly it's possible for awareness to be, but also I think one can so strongly desire good things, but be too weak to find them, and by their weakness they participate in things that cannot mix, cannot blend with the way, the being that's necessary for goodness to be brought about. But that aside, we've moved those clouds away, so it doesn't really matter where this person is at. We have found the person that is into the Sophist identity. What is being said here is that his place, where he is contained, in copy making and appearance making, again, like we've said, positive and negatives to them, that these are totally not. So, if we've established well, I think at this point, that if something is by itself, it is all the way down. Now, of course, there may be blending, but when we take a principled identity, regardless of its associations, and however temporary its existence in this form may be, I think sorry, I'm arranging my chess pieces to represent what we were speaking about. I think it is the case, and I wonder if it's not even more so the case, when a person believes it. Now, belief is different than many of the things that come to mind upon earlier discussions, like broad concepts that stretch over fundamental pieces of matter. Or just plain ideas, images in mind, especially when we talk about the king, that which is, and having his identity, his form, and have it be split up by difference. I think that this difference that the Sophist possesses, if he is truly to commit to that, he would have to perform in a contradiction. The contradiction would be something perhaps that he truly believes in and somehow has oriented his heart to enjoy it, or he is to be burdened by otherness. So again, there's two situations. One, he can be just fine with constantly partitioning himself up, his beliefs, perhaps his whereabouts, his personality. Or he's burdened by it, but he can't really see beyond it. And by this burden, the performative contradiction emerges. And that performative contradiction I think necessarily must be that despite this perpetual cleaving of parts of the self, of the agent, there is this desire for unification, but maybe because of his survival that prompts him to do this sort of thing, or his profound ignorance and lack of belief, not because he disbelieves others, but because he has not yet been convinced by others. That this difference drives him to such extremes as to enthrall the minds of young people. And to create an entire apparatus around his struggle. Willful, non-willful, who knows where he might be expressed, in what corner of life that might express him. But if I haven't gotten there yet, I think much like in the case of that which is, there, if being under no difference, there would be no experience, there would be no speech, there would be no reflection on the part of the agent. Because it is. It's understood. Needs not be explaining. On the other hand, we have this non-being, which I still maintain is a submissive form. It submits to that which is. But maybe I should be a bit careful. I don't think there's a harmony between the two. And I should be a bit careful about non-being. We all should be careful about non-being. But for all of the discord that it brings, it affords us experience. We all are by it. And because there is this relationship of things that are being by difference, to define them and to outline them, or maybe to outline them, that which is may define it. But to have now a person that willfully, or again, whatever story we want to use, let's say willfully dives into the belief that his art that speech, the fundamental way in which we communicate, is grounded in nothing but difference, in otherness. And here I remember I've gotten to this point, the point at which the identity is sort of broken up into different pieces. Of course, if it's a true belief. And it's broken up into many different pieces because there's no functional difference between that which is not and his beliefs about speech, about copy making, about appearances. They must necessarily fall on the side that is, if it could be said, split down the middle between that which is and that which is not. But of course the two are blended forms. So that sort of thing is a large hypothetical, but it's a hypothetical that I think it allows us to see the former type of blending. So we find ourselves on the fence of non-being. We've explained what it means and what it looks like to be on the side of being, destructive to all things that are except one. And then, on the other hand, we have one that is destroyed. We have that which is, the concept of that which is, the whole that that which is leaves. To be surrounded by this thing. To be constantly perseverating over this. To such a degree that, I, for whatever reason, I think about a person that's psychologically disturbed and they're tearing against the ground and their fingers are all bloody, no more fingernails, or almost like the scene in Band of Brothers. Now that I think about it, when they're in the forest and it's in winter, and because of this shell shock, he's going through quite a psychotic break. But down here in the perpetually divided attention, divided identity, divided view of things, we find almost an equal type of, what would I say, non-experience, maybe? I think non-experience is a good way to describe it. Not non-being, but non-experience. I think that needs some work, at least that definition, but perhaps we'll come back there. Non-being has found in itself a condition that is a necessary condition that shows the hand of that which is in its existence. By making its existence necessary in order to divide things that are. But only to do it such that it may do it. If that makes sense, I don't know. When I think about a condition in which nothing is, there is nothing to divide, so nothing can be. But I think about a situation of being that existed. I'm not sure if time is relevant, but we could say pre-existed, or maybe just existed, alongside of this non-being. And it was, even in the simplest of form, not necessarily in terms of intelligence maybe, or awareness of being. Again, I want to say that time might not be important here, so we may zoom past ourselves or into realms that are unexplored, but possible. So again, we take time out of it. In this, on this side of the fence into nothingness, I said this, but I want to put a highlighter on it, perhaps, just to dwell on it a bit more, to feel it. That if there's nothing for non-being to chew on, there is nothing. But you could say that nothing, if it is something that is something. And perhaps in this way it gives birth to something. And when it gives this birth, now there's this explosion of thingness. Because there is this explosion of thingness, we have everything that comes back. We have oneness, we have knowing of all things, and then we have separation out into difference. And this separation out into difference sorry, my mind is going on a separate tangent about Christ, so I'm trying to keep myself focused on what I'm saying here, but there's an interesting story that, it's not really a story, it's like a video that's playing in my mind about Christ's experience, ascension, exactly what that means for all of us. But anyway, there's something to be said about sharp angles. Maybe not sharp angles. Well, any angle, I suppose, but the sharper ones are more interesting. Because they come together so suddenly. In the case of the larger angles, it's like there's time to get there. They intersect. But they intersect in time. Now, if they reflect back in the same direction, that 0 to 180 degrees, they're going to be sharper, probably. Especially, if they have to make some sort of angle. But let's ignore the excess of the analogy. The point being is that when two things come together, I think about this angle. Think about the vertex, I think they call it. And this coming together point may take, after that coming together point, when there is this diffusion out at the other side, and maybe I should say for a moment that I'm trying to follow up on this idea away from the fences between that which is and that which is not. We found ourselves into the blended territory, and now thinking about the nature of the blended territory. We have this sort of super precise analogy of the angular nature of it. Perhaps that simplifies it. And then on the other side, there is the blending like a fluids blend, almost. Like it's so seamless. I think both are good ways to describe them. They're just different reflective principles, reflective tools. But the angular, it makes things simple to describe describe that which is very complex. And with regard to these angles, and again, in my mind, in the first instance, I thought about I guess it would be a diamond shape, in which you have two quite acute angles, and then two oblique angles that make this whole, this diamond. But as I said that, and as I think about the usefulness of it as an analogy, because now we have this thing that is identifiable in terms of the relationship between non-being and being, I think then about the fact that there can be a multiplicity of shapes that can be made. And if there is a multiplicity of shapes that can be made, we find ourselves back in the same territory between difference and coming together. So it doesn't really matter, I think, in the totality of things, but what we have to think about is at least just one example. Now in the first, with the diamond example or analogy, what we see is the relationship of that which is and that which is not. So at each vertex, we would have to expand the analogy more. And I realize that I went on that tangent for a purpose, but we'll get there when we get there. So one vertex of thingness happened. Maybe I can't say it that way. One vertex between that which is and that which is not has happened. And so the question is, what happens at the vertex? Regardless of the big shape of things, what happens at the vertex? I think what happens... My thoughts are getting a bit kaleidoscopic. But I think what happens is that which is not, non-being, absence, the way that participates in that which is, or being, is now harmonious. I don't think that non-being is subject to it. But I think it's harmonious in a bizarre way that I don't understand. The way in which I don't understand it is the following. If we are to swing in such ways as to see completeness in the identity of that which is, and to see completeness in the identity of that which is not, we can conceive of periods in which the relative relationship of one to the other can maximize identity, maximize that which is, and diminish that which is not. But there's a certain point at which it crosses over. Because in order to expand that which is, in one sense, what must be introduced is difference. But at a certain point, to retract from that which is to move towards difference and non-being and absence. And as perceiving agents, I think that we navigate this experience, and so we have a particular view of it, of course, as we must. I think we are given such an opportunity because of what we are and what we can experience. But that being said, we're talking about angles. We're talking about a convergence. And we're talking about a separation. So we've talked a little bit about the vertex. I'm not satisfied. But all the same, I want to know then what this moving away point is. We could say that it's a moving away point because of difference, because of the tendency towards non-being. I think in my initial explanation there was the assumption quite strongly of something like time. the necessity for its existence, not just because of our experience, our short-term experience, but for the process of one of the tools of difference to exert its influence. And if we are to say that sort of philosophically, conceptually, that there are laws of mind, we can find ourselves thinking about difference and sort of intellectualizing it in the sense that if we think about the bishop and then his 4 pawns that I've been using traditionally to describe identities, walk myself through this dialogue, I see myself taking apart one of the pawns that are around him, such that this part of him goes out into that which is, and he makes difference by adding a dimension. In this case, it's time. And this dimension, this measurable thing that is time, affects certain types of reality. The mind of man being one, but also the form of things, physical objects, cognitive beings that may exist in the universe. If one hasn't done so, I'd recommend myself watching again, and anybody who may find themselves this deep into this thing, that video of, or there's a bunch of them, I think, on YouTube, that zooms, starting at the Earth and zooms out into what we understand our universe to be. And it's amazing how small we are in the vast possibilities of things that are. The visitor continues, his ground would be that belief and speech don't associate with that which is not, and that without this association, falsity totally is not. So today is a new day. Sorry for the disruption, but I feel a particular way today. I feel about moving at a particular pace. I tend to be one that moves a bit slower anyway, for better or for worse. But I think about, just as a general reflection on things, I'm reminded of these experiences that stick with me. They're memories, but obviously memories of experiences, where something becomes so sweet, so seamless, blissful in a way, a type of enjoyment that is natural and pure. The mind often finds itself in that disposition of retreat or of preoccupation. Often the preoccupation is unaware or temporarily unaware of the broader experience that the agent is participating in, and perhaps that the agent believes. And it's a shame to get stuck in the confines of routine. Not that routine in and of itself is bad, because of course it's an important component in discipline to do something regularly. But all the same, I think the routine affords a danger to roads that we can take, either the productive or of the passive. And this passivity I think, is the thing that reduces us. It reduces our potential. Now, the passive, I think, is an element that is, it can be quite subtle. Because there are plenty of ways in which passivity may play a role in our lives, much like routine, and not necessarily have a negative effect. But the passivity comes in, and it takes us away from those experiences that we all remember. Perhaps it was a particular smell at a particular time of day within a particular company. His ground would be that belief and speech don't associate with that which is not, and that without this association, falsity totally is not. So the concept of his ground is interesting. I want to put out as a general reminder that we have set out on the hunt for the Sophist. I almost think about narrowing down the truth to be somewhere ungrounded. It's not the only way to think about it, of course, but if we are not on level ground, it's surely the desire to get to level ground. Perhaps part of that is the risk of falling from a height. Level ground is stable. It's understood. It's known. Predictable. And I think all of us, despite the necessity for the creative outlet and for expanding into different areas, the ground is the place that we find ourselves most at home, or most known, I should say. There's a sentimental, but also there can be more of a non-judgmental way of seeing it, if I could say such a thing. His ground would be that the belief and speech don't associate with that which is not. Now, I'm going to gather my chess pieces here. I should have done this before I started the episode, or rather this part of the episode. So again, he says, his ground would be that belief and speech don't associate with that which is not. So there are plenty of ways that we can go here. First, I want to take our bishop of difference and his pawns and to reflect on his capacity for a moment, as I think it is fundamental when we are speaking of that which is not. For it is by his action that things are separated and made other, so that one thing becomes distinct from another. So I think we've spoken about this to a particular extent, but I suppose it's going to be useful to get back into that headspace. So, in the sense that they do not associate in that which is not, I think it has been established that in this case, and in the case of not sharing in that which is, we have our dilemmas. The two cannot exist independently. Or rather, I should say, it's kind of an irony to say the two can't exist independently. But rather, the two exist as a unified experience. That it is not necessarily needed to be seen as something separate between that which is and that which is not. But of course it's identifiable. But moving away from that, if we say that something doesn't participate in one of them, and in this case, that which is not, then they are a particular type of interesting phenomena, I guess. Because you still have the separation of difference out there that is making things different from one another. So we put our king of that which is aside, and we have attributed to him strong associations, such that as we look at it, we can't identify it, because there is no difference to make it other, and so it is that which is. But how is it possible then to see speech, to see belief, if it was entirely connected to that which is? And I think the answer is that it's impossible. Because the identity of that which is would remain the same. And we would still have difference participating around it. So effectively what we would have done was just erased or deleted belief and speech from the entire framework of reality. But it's not until difference that comes to find them, not to take them away from that which is, but to separate it, to order it, to classify it, then we have found how speech and how belief can continue to be. So I think in response to the Sophist, it's quite clear that his ground is not actually ground, it's something that's unstable. Or perhaps it's stable in ignorance, in the sense that he would not be able to participate in belief or speech, which of course he does. So you know that actually isn't his ground. Maybe on some layer he believes that, sort of as a split person inside of him. It's hard to say. Or he believes it because he's trying to deceive. And deception was something that we surely had mentioned when we mentioned the sort of the unfortunate side effects of an agent that experiences this reality, that we can see the antagonistic side of difference and of otherness. His ground would be that belief and speech don't associate with that which is not, and that without this association, falsity totally is not. But if it participates in anywhere other than anywhere in general, there's going to be this falsity. That's why we have to search around for speech, belief, and appearance, and first discover what they are, so that when they appear, we see their association with that which is not clearly. So it's a clever move on the part of the visitor. It's a strategic move. On this hunt, we have him cornered. We have him cornered in a strange way, in a contradiction, but the contradiction exists between a few different identities that are mentioned. speech, belief, and appearances. So it seems like we're about to go on a new journey and really try to figure out what these things are. But conceptually, it makes sense that you would want to understand that which is deemed to be inseparable, how such a thing must not be, which we've established, but then also how it can be shown to have a river that flows through it. Again, in a productive manner. It is not to see the case for that which is not in matters of extreme importance to us, like our beliefs or our speech or appearances, that these things are willfully separated. They must be. Just as the whole necessarily participates with itself, this dynamic tension between that which is and that which is not. Then when we've seen that clearly, we can show that falsity is, and when we've shown that, we can tie the sophist up in it. And if we can keep hold of him, or else we'll let him go and look for him in another kind, Theaetetus responds, he says, "What you said at the start seems absolutely true. The sophist is a hard kind to hunt down. He seems to have a whole supply of roadblocks." And so this is where Theaetetus gets a bit disheartened about how the sophist jumps off one ledge and into a new prison, I guess, that we have to dig him out of. But I think Theaetetus seems to miss exactly where we're at, this fundamental junction. He says, if you had given up in this situation, what will you do some other time when you don't get anywhere, or even are pushed back? A person like that would hardly capture a city, as the saying goes. But since we've done what you have just said, my friend, the largest wall may already have been captured, and the rest of them may be lowered and easier. So the visitor, all the while, Theaetetus surely too, understands that this fundamental layer, that when we've established strongly difference between the areas that he hides, wherever he chooses to hide next, it's not going to be very difficult to refute. You know, in some way, as the visitor takes us on our new task, he says, then let's take up speech and belief, as we said just now. That way we can calculate whether that which is not comes into contact with them, or whether they're both totally true and neither one is ever false. It pains me a little bit to know that the visitor wishes to go down the road of falsity. When we think about difference and separation between identities, falsity, of course, is a natural consequence, a possibility of what may be. But I wonder why he doesn't think more in terms of connectedness to that which is, or at least, rather, I should say, the ways in which that which is not or otherness participates in that which is. But I do like this path that we are taking up speech and belief, to identify them, to understand them better. And all of this is in defense of truth. It is to push out the sophist away from corrupting the youth, essentially. So we are prompted to move in a particular direction. The visitor says, let's think about names again, the same way as we spoke about forms and letters of the alphabet. What we were looking for seems to lie in that direction. So let's think for a moment about what is being said here. Now, letters, I'll say firstly, are the building blocks for words. They're the fundamental tools that we use to build our cognitive landscape, the meaningful landscape, through language. The letters in and of themselves don't really mean much. Now, there's a part in the dialogue earlier, I can't remember which episode this is included in, but it's somewhere in there, where the visitor made the distinction between consonants and vowels, in the sense that when two consonants are together, they flow together. They don't afford productive speech. Another way we can say it is that they are incomplete sounds. The vowels connect and harmonize the consonants. This gives this sort of bridge, and language becomes this now more of an expanded structure, or at least the sounds that we can produce, the things that we can combine to build that linguistic bridge becomes apparent. Now we can extend this out, the analogy out, into the forms and into being in general. Of letters, I think we could say it is something that is. We can contribute being to it. But much like the letters as being fundamental building blocks, the forms, in the same way, can have their fundamental or elemental units, but not all of them would be coherent. Not all of them would be recognizable as things that are inherently meaningful. But it's within combination, within the pattern, that we find the true meaning and the true beauty, the true relation. Now, in my mind, there is a relationship between all of these things that he has mentioned here. I think there are three. He mentions names, he mentions forms, and he mentions letters. Of course, names are composed of letters. Letters and names are forms, can be forms. They're both representations of that which is, and they must necessarily participate in that which is not. The visitor says, the question about them that we have to answer is whether they all fit with each other, or none of them do, or some of them will and some of them won't. He says, names that indicate something when you say them one after another fit together, and names that don't signify anything when you put them in a row don't fit. So this is our first conjecture. Often I find myself, when I think about things, I give up too easily. I don't even want to start somewhere because I feel that wherever I start, I know that it's not going to be good enough. In the sense that it might betray some principle I know, maybe not I know, but has been firmly established, and there's danger in that. But sort of what I'm getting at is the concreteness of a claim often serves to be limiting. But the important thing is that we have a claim and we start somewhere. So let's think about what he said here. Names that indicate something when you say them one after the other fit together. And names that don't signify anything when you put them in a row don't fit. So I'm thinking about the way in which he means names. At the outset, when I see the word names, I think about names of people, establishing identities. Now, I think that this is true all the way down, but there's a particular way in which a name establishes an identity for a person. The other way in which I see this is the naming of thingness, that which is. It is sort of an extension of our bishop. As he moves his pawns out into reality, and they encounter identities, they establish difference between things. They also inadvertently establish barriers. Identities. And so much like in Genesis when God says, be fruitful and multiply, man's place is to name the animals, to name everything that there is on the earth. It is that decision, it is that direction of mind to reach out and to sort of be the bishop, play the role of the bishop, of difference, of identification. And so in this way, names has such a broad stroke to it that is not to be restricted to anything in particular. But by the same token, the concept of relevance comes into play here. And that surely it is a relevant thing that when man observes something, when he sees something, that he is able to fit the identity in his mind in such a way that it is something that makes sense. Now, there's a specific way in which I mean it must make sense. Now, it doesn't necessarily, if I look outside my window and I look at a tree, I don't have to understand it at all levels of perspective. I don't have to see the cells to understand that they're there. I don't have to understand that there are these cells that participate in this way at that level to interact with it. But if there can be such a thing, a sort of a disharmony, let's say. I think about a being, an agentic being. Somehow, maybe this isn't the best place to go, but it's an interesting thought experiment, I suppose. A being that just sort of pops in and pops out of itself. There's a confusion in identity, but somehow, by some small sliver of a form somewhere, it is able to maintain itself. Perhaps its awareness is intermittent. Its physical form perhaps is intermittent. In the moments of its non-identity and its confirmation, perhaps its reduction back into the identity of that which is, this may be a stretch, I have to wonder at. We'll keep that as it is. But I say that to say because when we think about names that are put together that establish some coherence, and then names that are together that don't make any sense, this is sort of what comes to mind. He says, since there are two ways to use your voice to indicate something about being, one kind is called names, the other is called verbs. Now, outside of the question Are there more than two kinds, or two ways to use the voice to indicate something about being? Let's put that aside and just follow this as necessary. Two ways to indicate something about being: names and verbs. A verb is the sort of indication that's applied to an action. And a name is the kind of spoken sign that's applied to things that perform the actions. Now, of course, we're speaking about agents, we're speaking about human beings, and we're speaking about other animals that possess a degree of language. If we start with the word indicate, a verb is the sort of indication that's applied to an action. What does this mean? In the literal sense, the word indication means the act of declaring towards, or the process of pointing out something. Now, this is applied to some action, to some process of doing. And I think that there's a strong relationship between indication and the, let's say, action of otherness, or action of non-being, action of difference. So again, of that thing for which we call doing or acting, one of the fundamental ways in which we participate with the world is through, at least in part, an aspect of difference, an aspect of non-being. And of course it has to be. In everything that we do and everything that we are, there is the intermixing between this, that which is and that which is not. Now what's interesting, on the other hand, is when we speak of names, is that there's this constancy. It is the sign for things that perform the actions. I don't want to speak too much here, because this is going to evolve, but interesting. He says, so no speech is formed just from names spoken in a row, and also not from verbs that are spoken without names. Things don't form speech if they're said in a row like this. For example, walks, runs, sleep. And other verbs that signify actions. Even if somebody said of them one after the other, that wouldn't be speech. So I'm going to leave this on a bit of a cliffhanger, because that's the end of the page that we were just on. And it happens to be at the 2-hour mark, so I want to end this episode here. So we're making good headway. We are on page, out of the book at least that I'm reading, 286. This dialogue ends on 293. So we have a few more pages of good reading here and thinking about the Sophist before it ends. So until next time.